There's a particular kind of arithmetic that starts mattering once your income stops growing every year, the way it used to. Once a raise isn't coming next January, no matter how well the year went or how hard anyone worked. No cost of living bump waiting quietly on the other side of December. Every single dollar has to actually earn its place in the budget once that happens, and a lot of things that felt harmless when a paycheck was still climbing suddenly look very different once it isn't anymore. Once it simply stays where it is, month after month, while everything around it keeps quietly getting more expensive without anyone asking your permission first. So I went through my own spending, line by line, sitting at the kitchen table with a highlighter and a stack of statements I hadn't really looked at closely in years, pages of small charges I'd stopped truly seeing a long time ago, and found 15 things that were quietly costing me far more than they were actually worth. Here's what I stopped paying for, and what I found instead once I did. The first thing to go was name-brand groceries, which I'd never once questioned in decades of shopping the exact same way, reaching for the familiar box or can without a second thought, simply because it was familiar. I started buying the store brand instead, item by item, testing each one against the version I was used to before I fully committed to the switch across my whole cart. More than half the time, I genuinely couldn't tell the difference once it was actually on the plate in front of me, seasoned and cooked the same way I always made it, and the handful of times where I could tell weren't worth the extra money anyway once I weighed it honestly against everything else on the list I was trying to manage. Extended warranties were next, and this was the one that took me the longest to actually give up, because they're sold to you at exactly the moment you're least likely to say no, standing at a register having just spent real money on something you want to protect, a friendly clerk asking casually if you'd like to add just a little more coverage for peace of mind. But I sat down one evening and did the math on every warranty I'd bought over the past decade, digging through old receipts to find each one, and the total I'd spent on all of them combined came out to more than it would have cost me to simply replace the handful of things that actually did break during that same stretch of time. The warranty, it turns out, mostly just pays for someone else's peace of mind, not yours, no matter how it's framed at the counter. My gym membership was the third thing I let go of, not because I stopped caring about staying active, which still matters plenty to me at this stage of life, but because I realized I was paying monthly for something I was actually using maybe twice a month at best, if that, most months closer to once, the card sitting untouched in my wallet the rest of the time, a quiet reminder every time I opened it of money I wasn't getting anything back for. A daily walk around the neighborhood, some simple exercises at home with nothing more than my own body weight and a bit of floor space, cost me nothing at all and, if I'm honest, did just as much for me physically as that gym membership ever did. Without the drive there and back eating into the time I could have spent actually moving instead of sitting in traffic to get somewhere to move, or circling a parking lot looking for a spot close enough to bother. I'd been paying for a storage unit for almost 3 years, filled with things I genuinely couldn't tell you the contents of if you'd asked me directly before I finally went and looked properly. One Saturday afternoon that turned into most of the day. An entire Saturday spent going through box after box revealed that most of what was inside should have been donated or thrown away years earlier. Furniture I'd already replaced, boxes of papers I never once needed again, and the handful of things actually worth keeping fit easily into a single closet at home once I finally sorted through everything honestly. That storage unit had been quietly costing me more every single month than most of what was sitting inside it was worth in total, a fact that was genuinely uncomfortable to sit with once I did the math standing right there in the unit. Cable television got trimmed down to almost nothing, a basic package instead of the full bundle I'd been paying for, without really watching most of the channels included in it, channels I couldn't have named if you'd asked me to list them. I went through and counted honestly how many channels I actually turned on in a typical week, sitting with the remote and a notepad one evening, and the number was embarrassingly small compared to what I was paying for the other 100 or so I never once selected in months, sometimes years. My bank account was quietly charging me a monthly fee I'd stopped even noticing on my statement, the way you stop noticing something after it's been there long enough, buried among a dozen other lines of small print I never bothered reading closely. I switched to a different account entirely, one with no fee attached at all, comparing a few options one evening online before making the decision, and the process took less than an hour on a Tuesday afternoon, an hour that ended up saving me more over the following year than most of the bigger changes I made on this entire list combined. It's worth pausing here for a second, because I want to say something clearly rather than gloss past it the way I might on a less important point. When it comes to medications, I'm not a doctor, and I'd never tell anyone watching this to make a change without talking it through with their own physician or pharmacist first, someone who actually knows their full medical history. But it's worth simply asking the question out loud at your next appointment, plainly and without embarrassment, because in many cases, a generic version exists that costs a fraction of the brand name and works exactly the same way, and nobody offers that information to you automatically unless you think to ask for it yourself directly. I think there's something worth naming, honestly, about a fixed income specifically, something a little different from ordinary budgeting advice you might hear from someone still working full-time with room to simply earn more if a month gets tight. There's no lever to pull when things get expensive, no overtime shift to pick up, no reasonable expectation that next year will simply bring more money in to cover whatever this year didn't. Every single change on this list, in a sense, had to matter, because the income side of the equation genuinely wasn't moving, no matter how carefully or thoughtfully I planned around it. That's not something to feel sorry about, and I don't feel sorry about it myself most days. It's simply the actual shape of the problem, and I found it easier to solve once I stopped wishing it were a different shape entirely and just started working with the one I actually had in front of me. Insurance add-ons were another quiet drain I hadn't looked at closely in years, sitting on my policy renewing automatically every 12 months, without my ever pausing to reconsider whether I still needed any of it. A rider here, a small extra coverage there, each one added at some point for a reason I could no longer clearly remember when I actually called to ask about it directly, sitting on hold with a pleasant recorded voice for longer than I expected. I sat down with my policy and asked, plainly, what each add-on actually covered and whether I genuinely needed it anymore, given how my life had changed since I'd first signed up for it years earlier. A few of them, it turned out, I didn't need at all anymore, circumstances having shifted well past whatever had prompted adding them in the first place, and canceling them lowered my monthly payment by a real, noticeable amount right away. I stopped paying for a lawn service and went back to doing my own yard work, the way I did for most of my life before I ever considered paying someone else for it, back when it never once occurred to me that it could be handed off to a stranger with a truck. It took some getting used to. My knees aren't quite what they were 20 years ago, but I found a rhythm that worked for me, breaking the work into smaller sessions across the week instead of one long, exhausting afternoon that used to leave me sore for days afterward. The money saved was real. A meaningful line item gone from the monthly budget entirely, so, unexpectedly, was the satisfaction of looking at a yard I'd actually worked on myself, hands in the dirt, rather than one someone else had simply been paid to maintain on my behalf. Eating out, which had crept up gradually over the years into something closer to a habit than an occasional treat, a quick stop here, a tired Tuesday there, got scaled back to something genuinely occasional again, the way it used to be when I was younger, and money was tighter in a different way. Not eliminated entirely, I still enjoy a meal out now and then, sitting across from a friend with nothing to clean up afterward, but deliberate rather than automatic now, planned rather than a default answer to a tired evening when cooking felt like too much effort to even consider. I gave myself a simple rule for anything I wanted to buy online that wasn't already on a list, a genuine necessity I'd planned for in advance rather than something that caught my eye scrolling late in the evening. Wait 24 hours before actually placing the order. No exceptions. Cart left sitting untouched overnight. More often than I expected, that urge had faded entirely by the next day, replaced by something else entirely or simply forgotten altogether, and whatever I thought I couldn't live without the evening before turned out to be something I'd completely forgotten about by morning, unable even to remember what it had been. Subscription boxes, the kind that arrive every month whether you remember signing up for them or not, got canceled one by one once I actually sat down and looked at what I was paying for all of them combined, listed out on paper where the total couldn't hide behind a dozen separate small charges scattered across different statements. A beauty box here, a snack box there, each one individually small enough to feel harmless, easy to justify on its own, but added together they came to a genuinely surprising monthly total once I finally wrote it all down and forced myself to actually look at the sum. I made myself a firm rule about credit cards, one I should have set decades earlier if I'm honest with myself about it looking back. Whatever gets charged in a month gets paid off completely by the time the bill arrives. Every single time. No exceptions made for a tempting purchase or a tight month that felt like a good enough reason in the moment. Carrying even a small balance forward, I discovered once I actually looked closely at the numbers and how interest compounds over time, costs far more over a year than most people realize until they sit down and calculate it properly with a pencil and actual patience. And the last thing was my phone plan, which I'd been paying a premium price for without ever once shopping around to see what else was actually available to me, staying on the same plan for years simply out of inertia more than any real loyalty to the company. A lower-cost plan, it turned out, offered nearly everything I actually used on a daily basis. The calls, the texts, enough data to check my email and look something up when I needed to, and the handful of features I gave up in the Switch were things I genuinely hadn't used in years, if I'd ever used them at all. Features I couldn't even fully explain if you'd asked me what they did. None of these 15 changes, taken on their own, felt like much of a sacrifice once I actually made them. That was the real surprise in all of this, more than any single number I could point to on a page. Together, though, they added up to a genuinely meaningful difference in what's left over at the end of each month. Real room to breathe that simply wasn't there before, without my life feeling smaller or more restricted for any of it, without a single thing I actually valued disappearing from my day-to-day. I sat down about 6 months after I'd started making these changes and did the math properly, the same careful way I'd approached the whole thing from the beginning, and the total genuinely surprised me. Between the warranties, the storage unit, the lawn service, and everything else on this list, I was keeping a real, substantial amount more in my own pocket every single month than I had been before. Money that used to disappear quietly into a dozen different places I'd stopped paying close attention to over the years. It didn't happen all at once, and I want to be honest about that rather than making it sound simpler than it actually was. Some of these took a few tries to really stick. A canceled subscription that I nearly resubscribed to out of habit within the first week. A warranty I almost renewed on an old appliance before I caught myself and remembered why I'd stopped in the first place. A friend of mine, going through something similar on her own end, told me she felt a little embarrassed at first, going through her spending this closely, as though noticing it somehow meant she'd been careless all along without realizing it. I understood exactly what she meant, because I felt something close to that myself in the beginning. But I don't think it's about carelessness at all, not really. Most of these 15 things are simply designed to be easy not to notice, spread out in small monthly amounts, specifically so that no single one of them ever feels worth the trouble of questioning on its own. It's only when you put them all in one place, side by side, that the real picture actually comes into view. If you're on a fixed income yourself, or simply watching your own budget more closely than you used to, for whatever reason brought you here today, it might be worth doing exactly what I did. Sit down for one afternoon, go through everything you're actually paying for, statement by statement if you have to, and ask yourself honestly, item by item, whether each one is still earning its place in your life the way it once did, or whether it's simply been sitting there quietly, unquestioned, for far longer than it should have been.